Okay, now, in the last lecture, we discussed, now let's start. We discussed the policies of development and growth followed by A, the developed nations after the Second World War, and B, the developing nations after the Second World War, which were fundamentally different because of their different historical backgrounds and the context in which they came from. Now, by the late 1970s and the 1980s, you actually see a major change in the global economic scenario, okay, which has its impacts on development policies in developing and developed countries of the world. You are still talking. Okay. Now, first, possibilities that did not exist before began to exist now. Thanks to the growth of technology, thanks to the growth of world markets, thanks to the growth of communications, thanks to the growth of computing technologies, and so on and so forth. Possibilities of global capitalist economic development that did not exist in the 1960s and 70s began to exist in the 1980s and 1990s. That's point number one. So some things would not simply have been possible without this growth of technologies. Okay, satellite technologies, computer technologies, aviation technologies, and so on and so forth, which did not exist before, they existed now. So potentials begin to emerge in this period for globalizing your capitalist economy more than what you could in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Point number one. Point number two is that further accumulation in the presence of social contracts, in the presence of a social democratic state in the developed world, the possibilities of profit increasing indiscriminately was limited by labor security for laborers, higher wages, unemployment insurances, and so on and so forth. Right? Possibilities of capital accumulating itself indiscriminately and multiplying its profits were limited by these social security regulations and labor regulations that existed. Okay? Now, so tendency for wages. The impact that this had was on this. On labor. The compromise with labor, the alliance between capital and labor, which was built in the post-World War period, came under pressure. The compromise with labor came under pressure due to full employment policies, and the tendency was there for wages to rise and squeeze the profit share significantly. Squeeze the profit shares significantly. This was a very important reason for the social contract that existed. There was consistent pressure from the capitalist class in the developed world to break down and end the social contract. Okay? When Margaret Thatcher assumed power in the 1980s, in one of the speeches that she gave to the British Parliament, she said, "We have been thoroughly destroyed by the Labour's social contract policies till now." Labour. She was conservative, right? So, the Labour Party's full employment policies and social contract policies have actually destroyed the British economy, and hence I'm going to liberalize the British economy, privatize British Airways, British Railways, and so on, and I'm going to create a more free market economy than what existed in the earlier period. So the breaking, this was actively a result of the pressure mounted by the capitalist class on the governments in these countries to end the social contract, to roll back subsidies, to roll back social security allowances, to roll back unemployment allowances, to roll back free health systems, to roll back free education systems, and to privatize universities, privatize education, privatize healthcare. This pressure was a result of the desire of the capitalist class of of Europe and the United States to continue accumulating capital significantly. Okay, which was limited by the presence of state intervention and demand management policies in the earlier period. That's point number 2. First is global changes in technology which made certain things possible. Second is accumulation was seen as being blocked by the earlier social contract policies. Third is the emergence of finance in a big way, which did not exist earlier. Finance did exist, not that finance did not exist, but finance came to be existing in a new global, as a new global phenomenon, which was different from the earlier periods. First, throughout what is the major point? There was a growth in the offshore markets for dollars. That's the most important point that I want to make. If you see, throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, 50s and the 60s, when the social contract was being executed strongly, there was a major movement of dollars from US to European countries, right? US to Europe, partly because of Marshall Plan, because a lot of aid was given by United States to the European countries. It was partly for the rearmament of Europe, but it was also an outcome of simply because Europeans and Japanese became more competitive after Reconstruction. Okay, when they became more competitive after Reconstruction, more American investors moved their dollars from domestically within America to Europe, Japan, and so on, which created a strong international movement of dollars, which did not exist before. These dollars were largely existing within and moving within the boundaries of the nation state of the United States before. Now they were actually global, because they were moving to EU and Japan. This was partly because of aid, but partly also because these countries, Japan and Europe, by the 60s had recovered from the war. They were reconstructing themselves significantly, and they were becoming more competitive, thus attracting dollars in a competitive sense than simply receiving aid. So there was also a lot of FDI flows from US to Europe in this period. Now, when these dollars travel across the globe, they have to be parked somewhere. You need a banking system which will be allowing parking these dollars in an active sense, and the banks that were based in Europe, largely in London as well, continental Europe and London, became banks which received a lot of these dollars, okay, as deposits and otherwise. Now, these dollars were deposited with offshore banks, and American banks operating offshore could thus escape domestic regulations if they had remained within United States. These dollars had remained, or these investors had remained within United States and not moved the dollars out of United States, they would be subject to strong United States regulations on finance, which we saw post-New Deal. There were strong restrictions on finance that the United States government itself had put forward. These, when you move it outside, you're not anymore subject to your national regulations. You can actually be more free in a global sense. So a lot of these finance actually moved out of the United States, partly attracted by the competitiveness of those markets, but also just to escape regulations within the United States and to move it outside where regulations were probably freer or regulations were probably laxer. Okay? Now, in other words, the paradoxical situation here is that internal contradictions of a regulated financial system, say the United States financial system, the internal contradictions of a regulated financial system resulted in the creation of that very speculative finance that these regulations were supposed to curb or prevent. Right? So these were supposed to prevent speculative finance capital, the Emergency Banking Act or different Glass-Steagall Act of United States and so on, which were enacted to prevent free speculative global capital, ended up creating a new finance capital that was actually global. Right? These investors who were unhappy with domestic regulations of the United States could not do certain things with that finance. They simply moved it out. Okay, and now they were not subjected to those regulations the United States government had. Right? So you ended up creating escaping from the clutches of the old law, came a new type of finance capital, which was global now, not national. Is that clear? Am I conveying this? Yes? So this became a very important feature of this period. Now, so let me recap. Global changes in technology which allowed certain things to happen. Secondly, accumulation was seen as blocked by the social contract, and hence there was pressure to break the social contract. Thirdly, there was an international market for finance which was emerging in this period thanks to the movement of dollars from the United States outside. And fourthly, oil shocks. Okay? The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, which led to a major rise in the prices of oil in the 1970s, was a major shock to many of these economies. Okay? Because inflation simply begins to shoot up in this period because of rising oil prices. Okay? So oil price shock of 1973 further damaged the credibility of Keynesian demand management policies, because when this increased the inflation rate, conservatives who were actually always wanting to dismantle the Keynesian policy regime, they pinned the blame for inflation on loose Keynesian policies. They wrongly said that inflation is rising because you are actually spending a lot. The government is actually spending a lot thanks to Keynesian policies, and this spending is actually putting too much of money into people's hands, which is actually chasing too few goods, as a result of which you have inflation. Right? And hence, what you actually need to prevent inflation, which was actually external in its origin, which was the oil shock, but what was needed, the policy prescription offered to control inflation was actually a rollback of Keynesian demand management policies, a rollback or reduction of public expenditure so that you could actually cut down on inflation by reducing the money that people have in their hands and reducing the purchasing power of people. Right? So this became a very important rallying point for conservatives to argue against Keynesian demand management policies and argue its withdrawal or rollback. The door was now open for conservatives to stage a comeback. Welfare and demand management role of the state came under severe attack, and so did the idea of shared prosperity and collective bargaining, which existed in the earlier period between workers and the capitalists. Wage growth fell behind productivity growth, and income distribution began to worsen, which is what you saw in that graph. Right? This is the period when, post 1978-80 period, when inequality begins to rise in most of the Western societies, which has a very clear association with the rollback of the earlier policies of social democracy. Right? Social democracy existed in some form, but it was significantly weakened in these societies, significantly weakened in most of these countries. Right? Not that they were completely demolished, because there was constant people struggle, agitations against its rollback. Even today, it continues through these Occupy movements and so on. But the point is, they were weakened, and they were indeed weakened significantly over the last 20 to 30 years. Beginning from the 1980s onwards, 90s, 2000s, you see this weakening happening. So the feature of this period here is an attack on Keynesianism. An attack on Keynesianism, saying that it is unable to fulfill the objectives that it was introduced for. You look at the inflation, you look at falling growth rates globally, accumulation is not happening adequately. For this, you need to allow the market to function more freely, and for that you need a rollback of Keynesian demand management and public expenditure policies, and a freer hand for capital, a freer hand for free market policies to decide on how resources are allocated in the society and economy. Right? So this here the attack begins here in some sense. Now, once this happens, there are other changes that happen along with it, other economic changes that happen along with this in the 1970s and 1980s. What happened when the oil price shock? What did the oil price shock do? What did the oil price shock do? You know, what did the oil price shock do? It raised the oil prices, right? Somebody is getting this money. Somebody is earning this money, right? And the oil producing countries, oil companies, somebody is getting this higher amount for higher price for oil, right? So there is, as a result of the oil price shock, while inflation is rising in the economy as a whole, while common people are suffering, there is somebody who is making super profits, right? Now, what do they do with the super profits? These super profits are not small, right? You have a global oil price shock, right? Millions and billions and trillions of dollars are accumulated somewhere. Somebody is accumulating here. So it has contradictory effects on different parts of the world. As oil prices increased, incomes and savings of oil producers increased. What do they do with this? They can't eat, right? So their savings found their way as deposits in offshore banks, international banks, global banks, right? There are new deposits that are that come in the hands of these international banks. Now they have a lot of money now. These banks, right? They're flush, as in economics you call it. You're flush with liquidity, right? You have too much of money. Banks simply cannot take deposits and live with it, right? They have to make money through the interest differentials that exist between deposit and credit. Right? You take deposits at 5% and you lend at 10%. That's how you live. That's how bankers make profit. Right? You need to find new borrowers. There's too much of money that is accumulating in you as deposits, and you need to find new borrowers. Right? So the search for new borrowers begin. But in this period also, they find willing people who are ready to borrow. People who are willing, people and governments, more importantly, who are actually willing to borrow. For instance, many of these Latin American governments. Okay? For instance, Chile. Okay? You had a socialist leader called Allende, who was elected in Chile in 1973. In a very short while, you have him assassinated. Right? Thanks to the CIA. Right? And then you have Pinochet. Right? Pinochet is ready to borrow internationally. I'm giving an example. There are many like this. Mexico borrowed, Argentina borrowed, Peru borrowed. Right? But then there are people like Pinochet who are ready to borrow, who have no incentive to run an economy differently. Right? So you have some developing countries, especially in Latin America, obliging these banks by borrowing heavily from them. Right? So these countries have now found a new escape valve for the liquidity flush that they have post oil price shock of 1973. Now, for a while, if you take these borrowing, you take these loans, and you do grow for a short period, right? Because you would invest it somewhere, you would allow some sectors of the economy to grow. So there's a short period where you see a period of growth. But then how long? Quickly, there is a time which comes where you have to repay these loans. And at that point, international banks are very, very prompt in getting back and asking for loans to be repaid. And hence you have a period where these countries who borrowed heavily in that period are now trapped in a new kind of debt burden where incomes are not adequately growing to repay the loans that you took. Right? Plus, these countries anyway do not tax their rich internally in any form, because many of them are dictatorships which actually are supported by the elite in these countries, and the price for that is low taxes on the rich. So you neither have tax income, you accumulated a lot of debt from international banks, you are walking into a debt burden. Most of these Latin American countries. So For a while, developing countries could grow without facing the constraint posed by the availability of imports, but not beyond a point. As debt spiraled, these countries now had to borrow further to stay afloat. There's no other way. Okay? Who will lend? Okay? There's a point which is in the second bullet point. This is also a period where Reagan in the United States maintains a high interest rate regime. Right? So interest rates are very high. So the amount of money that you have to pay back is also very high in this period. So that actually adds as an additional pressure on your debt burden. And it leads to a lot of countries defaulting in this period. The 1982 debt crisis of Mexico, classic example, the most famous first example of a breakdown of an economy thanks to a debt burden in Latin America, followed by Brazil and many other Latin American economies. Argentina, a lot of other countries broke down in this period. When they were trapped into this debt burden, the first people that they turned into were the IMF. Can you give us a loan to repay that loan so that we could save our economies? Right? The IMF said, of course I'll give you. Of course I'll give you. I'm most happy to give you a loan. But, I have a few things. Right? If you do these. The global banks just wanted profits. Right? People who first gave these loans, they just wanted profits. So they had no conditionalities. Just give it back, that's it. Right? But these guys come with agendas. Right? They have a particular economic agenda. They have a particular economic objective in terms of shifting the economic policies of countries in the developing world in a particular direction and trajectory. So they will not give loan for free. Right? They will say they have a few conditions. In other words, conditionalities. Okay? You asked that question. Somebody asked that question in the first half related to why IMF should give. Somebody asked a question about IMF and World Bank. I don't see yes, you asked that question. Here is part of your answer. Right? So these countries now approach the IMF for loans. They obtained loans, but only if they administered what the conditionalities, which were all called as stabilization and structural adjustment. Okay, they're sometimes called as SAP, structural adjustment policies. Okay, that's a usual rhetorical short form that is used. Now, resolution of debt crisis. Now, this is a crisis which cannot be simply seen as a debt taken in a very normal situation, right? You cannot divorce history from this debt crisis, right? This debt crisis is partly because, beginning from colonialism, there is an impact on this. There is a path dependence in this crisis, right? There is actually a crisis which is inflicted by these. There is a crisis which has resulted from the colonial period through periods of independence, a particular global regime which allowed these economies to move into this crisis. And hence, that's why people call about resolving debt crisis. So debt is not simply by you have to write off a few debts. You have to that just follows a set of global rules of equity and democracy, because you need payments like this in order to compensate for the losses, for instance, of colonialism. Why not? For many centuries, you benefited from our raw materials. Right? Why can't you write off a few $1,000? Right? These questions come up when the debt crisis comes in these countries, which were prisoners of colonialism for a very, very long period of many centuries. These questions begin to come. So, resolution of debt crisis is a bit unfair, not like other debt crises, since both lender and the borrower were responsible for excessive borrowing. Now, this brings us to what these stabilization and structural adjustment policies are. What are these policies? First, you basically look for tight fiscal and monetary policies. Tight fiscal and monetary policies because you think that too much of demand, Tarana, Okay, tight fiscal and monetary policies where too much of demand leads to inflation. Right? Too much of demand can lead to inflation. So you basically cut down on public expenditure, which will actually lead to less money in the hands of people to chase goods, which will actually pull down inflation. You have that's a tight fiscal policy. You should have a tight monetary policy. That means interest rates are kept high so that people are discouraged from borrowing and then spending and thus chasing goods and thus creating price rise and thus creating inflation. Right? So you need both tight fiscal policies in terms of cuts in government expenditures. That's a rollback of Keynesianism. Okay? And on the monetary front, you need tight monetary policies where you will actually raise interest rates in order to keep prices low. That's what Subba Rao did. That's what Raghuram Rajan is doing. Right? Every quarter there is news in the newspapers, will RBI cut rates? Right? Industry wants a cut because they want cheaper loans. But Rajan says, or Subba Rao said that I can't cut because inflation is very high, and if I cut interest rates, borrowing will increase and it will further add to inflation rise. Hence, I will not cut interest rates. I may even raise it by 0.25 percentage points, 0.5 percentage points, all these numbers you read in the newspapers. These are measures of monetary policy in order to try and reduce inflation. So these policies are part of stabilization and structural adjustment. So tight fiscal and monetary policies. Secondly, public sector enterprises are inefficient and needs to be privatized. Right? Very common. Financial sector is seen as repressed because government is fixing interest rates. It's actually not allowing the banks and financial institutions to actually fix their own interest rates, which will allow savings and investment rates to rise in a particular way. This is, in economics, this is called financial repression. I'm not getting into the conceptual details here, but basically this argument, the financial repression theory makes the argument that if government administers interest rates, if the government fixes interest rates and gives it, you have to follow this interest rate to banks, this will actually create distortions in the financial market and ultimately lead to a fall in savings and investment in the economy, which is a flawed theory, but which is actually an argument which is put forward. Now, following this financial repression theory, proponents of financial liberalization argue that banks should be given a full freedom to fix their own interest rates. Right? I'll come back to it. Hold it. Okay? Towards the end, can we take this? That will be a digression if I start explaining this. Okay? Just understand that the argument makes the point that any administered interest rate, right, is a distortion in the financial market, and that will ultimately lead to a fall of savings and investment, and hence growth, employment. Right? That's the argument being put forward. Then, free trade. Countries should produce according to their comparative advantage, and trade should be liberalized. And comes WTO and other agreements which aim at creating a free trade market. Latin American countries followed these proposals very religiously because they had to get this money from IMF to come out of their debt crisis. They implemented most of these policies, and the results were disastrous. Okay, there is evidence from, for instance, Mexico, which actually will show you that after the Mexican debt crisis and adoption of IMF conditionalities, literacy rate fell. Right? So this kind of, why? Because there was a sharp cut in the expenditure on education, pushing children out of schools, and then leading to a rise in illiteracy. That's I'm just giving you one example to show the impact. So this is the reason why across Latin America, 1980s is seen as a lost decade. 1980s is seen as a lost decade. Lost decade means You had 82, the first debt crisis came. 83 other countries were hit. And then 84, 85 IMF came. Conditionalities began. 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. Disastrous impacts of these policies in the social sector because the cut of expenditures largely happened in the social sector. Social sector is a soft sector. It's a soft sector because nobody protests. Right? If you cut incentives for the rich, they will protest. They'll make sure that your government is pulled down. Right? But not otherwise. You can cut social sector, children, education. Who's going to protest? Unless there is a movement which is devoted to it. Nobody. So these are sectors you can cut freely and live with it without protest or with minimal protest. Okay? So whenever governments want to cut expenditures, they first touch those sectors which are soft. Right? Like education, health, nutrition, and so on. Right? Now, so you have now we have a set of, now these were the policies that were components of structural adjustment and stabilization. Now if you move, in other words, if 1980s was a lost decade for Latin America, the crisis moves to Asia in the 1990s, the next decade. Right? Asia was relatively untouched. Asia has not significantly liberalized in the 1980s. India, example. India liberalized in the 90s and not 80s. Right? So, by 1990s, the focus of international finance shifts to countries like India, and East Asian and Southeast Asian countries liberalize their financial markets partly in response to American pressure and partly because the elite in these countries had by then begun to internalize the dominant ideology of finance and had themselves begun to believe, without American pressure itself, begun to believe ideologically that these policies are good. Right? So you don't always, one of the things is always, the adoption of any kind of liberalization policy is not necessarily to be seen as some external thrust on you from external. Right? I mean, the Indian prime ministers that we have had in the last 20 years, they believed in it. They themselves believed in it. Isn't it? I mean, they might have done a few things in response to conditionalities, but it is equally true that they themselves also ideologically believed in the trajectories that they followed. Right? I'm not taking names, but it's as open a fact as it could be. So these countries liberalized, the Eastern and Southeast Asian countries liberalized their financial markets. South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, all these countries began liberalization in their financial markets in the 1990s. Koreans, for example, wanted to join the OECD. Okay? And in response, the price they had to pay was to open up their financial sector, to bring their financial sector on par with the financial regulations that existed in the OECD countries. So if you're joining a club, you have to follow the rules of that club, right? You can't, till recently you couldn't walk into some Chennai clubs with a dhoti, right? Right? There was a dress code. The analogy of a dress code here is that you have to have level playing fields in financial markets, right? So if you want to join OECD, you should have your financial regulations in parity with the financial regulations in OECD countries. So South Korea, Taiwan, all these countries significantly liberalized their economic financial sectors in the 1990s. The boy who is sitting behind you, two ladies. Come here, come. One of the ladies also get up. One of the ladies also get up. I give you the choice. One of you. Who among you? So Koreans wanted to join the OECD and they ended up liberalizing their financial markets significantly. As a result, speculative foreign capital flew into East Asian countries. So once you have opened financial markets, once you have liberalized the rules for entry and exit of finance into your country, then foreign investment flows in significantly. What is the point I'm making here? Look at every country which can, okay, I'll explain this in a moment, but let me finish this point. As a result, speculative foreign capital begins to flow into East Asian countries. And most of the foreign capital that was absorbed into the economy were moved into speculative purposes. So speculative bubbles began to emerge in the real estate markets to begin with, as in Thailand, or dangerously high levels to loans to the corporate sector, as in South Korea. Okay? When money comes in, the money has to move somewhere, right? In search of profits. So it moves into real estate in Taiwan and corporate sector loans in South Korea. Now, main detonators of the crisis were some bankruptcies in Thai. So these loans are given indiscriminately, and when something goes wrong somewhere, right, the whole system begins to break down because prices begin to get extraordinarily inflated, and when the bubble breaks at some point, people look for cash, and then cash is not available because all of your values in the economy, shares, etc., are actually valued according to inflated share prices. And when you start looking for cash, there is no cash, right? Most of your borrowings are based on such inflated valuations, and when you in the stock markets, and when the market breaks down, you start looking for cash. There is no cash. Banks don't get back their loans. Banks break down, and then the toxicity spreads, and the banking system itself begins to crash significantly. So, foreign capital responded negatively to vulnerabilities created by excessive foreign investment. And the IMF enters the picture again to help South Korea and Taiwan after the 1997 financial crisis in South Korea and Taiwan. And they do exactly the same that they did to Latin American countries in the 1980s, conditionalities, which leads to further liberalization of their financial sector, further vulnerabilities, further fragilities in the financial sector, increased risks, and anytime you're ready to break down. Right? Now, in other words, global mobility of capital is not something that is new to the 1990s and 2000s. Let me say that. Global mobility of capital existed always in some form. Okay? But earlier, global mobility of capital was actually capital for production. Capital for production. There's a difference between capital for production and the new form in which it begins to exist, which is capital as finance. Capital for production is now capital as finance. Capital is finance. You use capital, you accumulate capital, not to invest and produce some goods, but to speculate. It could be in real estate, it could be in the stock market, it could be anywhere. Okay? So, capital becomes global, and this globalization of capital is associated with increasing use of this capital for speculative purposes. Finished? Finished talking? Finished talking? Okay? Now, this transformation is a feature of Latin America in the 1980s and Southeast Asia in the 1990s. Is that clear? Am I clear? Right? Now, what is the point that we are making here? The larger issue here is the following. If you take I'll give you, I'm trying to create a conceptual argument here. Let's forget Latin America, let's forget East Asia, Southeast Asia. Let's see what happens to any normal country. Yep. I'm trying to say it. And that's exactly what I want to come to now. Okay? Look at any country which is open in its capital account. Open in its capital account means its laws are open to free entry and exit of finance, foreign investment. Okay? Now, this was a period where, after the high interest rate regime of Reagan in the United States in the 90s, for example, moved into a low interest rate regime. Okay? Low interest rate regime in order to generate growth internally. They wanted to cheapen the domestic availability of loans and to generate domestic growth in the 1990s. So they kept their interest rates low in order to generate growth, credit-led growth. However, if your finance is global, if finance can actually move from one country to another freely, and the major source of that finance, metropolitan country where the finance originates, United States, has actually a low interest rate regime, capital will have a very high incentive to move to other countries with higher interest rate. Right? In order to look for profits, they'll look for other countries, other economies which have relatively higher interest rates. Okay? In the 1990s, while the low interest rate regime in the United States led to significant domestic growth in the United States, it also led to a lot of the profits so generated and a lot of the money that became invested in pension funds, sovereign funds and so on in the United States to move out and look for other economies which have higher interest rates to make profits. Because pension funds, you need to make payments at some point. Pension funds need to make profits. Right? And how will they make profits? They will invest in different markets, financial markets, outside United States, which have a higher interest rate. So, other countries outside the United States now had an incentive to keep interest rates high. So that American capital will choose your country. Okay, you have a pressure to keep your interest rates high in order to pull capital into your country. Now, when this capital inflow begins, suppose you are successful, and you end up inviting and enticing a lot of American capital, foreign capital to flow into your country. What happens? They come with dollars. Am I right? They come with dollars? Do they come with rupees? No, they come with dollars. Now, they come with dollars and ask you for? They can't come into India and spend in dollars, right? If they want to buy a few shares in a company, want to invest in Bombay Stock Exchange, what will they do? They want rupee, right? So, Indian Central Bank takes those dollars and gives them rupee. Am I right? What does this do? What happens to the value of the currency as a result? You have too much of dollars, right? You're building your foreign exchange. Too much of dollars you are accumulating. As a result, the value of the dollar and value of the rupee goes up. You have appreciation. If the rupee was 50 rupees to a dollar, it is 60 rupees tomorrow. I'm sorry, for 40 rupees tomorrow. Good, you are listening. Okay? 40 rupees, that's the appreciation, right? Appreciation has a problem. When appreciation happens, what happens to exporters and importers? Exporters will be affected negatively and importers will be benefiting. Okay? It's actually a good thing. Some people don't mind it because let imports come, I have to pay the imports in dollars. Am I right? I can't pay a foreign company in rupees. I have to pay them in dollars, right? So when he comes, so I don't mind because I have foreign exchange. I am constantly enticing investors to come into my country. I have built up a reserve of dollars, so I don't mind paying. I pay it, right? And you constantly have this urge to keep on getting more and more foreign investment to keep on building your foreign exchange reserve significantly, right? Now, as a result, there is also likely to be growth, okay? Because a lot of investment probably takes place in the economy, okay? Real estate values rise, other things, some investment happens in different sectors, including the services sector, and some growth can happen. It will happen. The 8%, 9% growth that India had in the 2000s was actually driven by foreign capital inflows, to begin with at least. Okay? So growth can occur. So it's a happy period for everyone. It's a happy period for everyone. There's no problem. The moment there is a problem somewhere, okay, either your demand slows down, or something else happens in your economy, then the problem begins. And then the whole cycle reverses. And reversal can actually be more painful than the happiness of the ushering in. Right? How? For instance, why should foreign capital choose your country? A, of course, you look for interest rates. Okay? If you have higher interest rates, they will come to you. That's the reason why countries keep their interest rates high. But there's a flip side to it. The flip side is your own domestic credit costs are high. So your domestic industry will start complaining. Why are you keeping your interest rate so high? Pull it down. Okay? Why don't you give us the level playing field as the foreign capital? They can raise that question. Okay? So, and in response to that pressure from industrial houses, if the government actually reduces interest rates, then capital flow out. Okay? That's why this capital is speculative money. This is hot money. That's a name for it. Hot money. Hot money means it doesn't have any native place. It's a nomad. Today I'm in India, tomorrow I'm in Korea, day after tomorrow I'm in Afghanistan, the day after that I'm in Turkmenistan, wherever. Wherever I am. Right? That's its habit. Because its only rule for selecting a destination is, does it give me higher profit? Right? Now, any interest rate fall can actually move it outside. Okay? There are other things which can move it outside. And then we will talk about what happens when it moves outside. Okay? One is interest rate. The second is what happens when you have a reason to increase, you want to invest more in education. You want to invest more in health. You want to invest more in nutrition. Okay? And government makes that public expenditure available to these departments. In making public expenditure available to these departments, what the government does is it might want to borrow and invest in these sectors. When it borrows and invests, your fiscal deficit will go up. Right? Your budget deficits will go up. Now, for international finance, budget deficits are a very important indicator of the health of your economy. They are very scared of countries which borrow. Because they think that if you are a country which borrows more, you are actually a country which is more vulnerable. Tomorrow you may break down and all the money that I put into your market can actually go into a crisis and I may lose a lot of money. And hence, as soon as your country sees an increase of budget deficits, there is a tendency on the part of international finance to actually mark you, and through different credit rating agencies that exist, as BBB minus, BBB minus minus, and C plus, C minus, and so on. And then these actually act as an incentive for international finance to actually move out. Okay? So interest rates can increase and interest rates can fall and then they can go out. You may actually have a higher fiscal deficit and then they may go out. You may actually want to control capital. You may not want so much of appreciation of your currency because it's affecting your exporters. Right? If the currency moves from 50 to 40, it's actually affecting your exporters. So it's benefiting importers. Right? So if you want to have an export-led strategy, the country may decide, okay, I cannot allow my currency to appreciate so fast and so much. I may want to put some constraint on the inflow of foreign capital into my country so that I don't get indiscriminate flow of finance into my country. Okay? The moment you start talking about putting some kind of constraint on the inflow or outflow of capital from your country, the financial sector explodes and then outflow begins. Okay? You don't need much. I'll give you an example. A political example. Okay, 2004. Okay, a new UPA government had come to power. Had just come to power. I'll give you an example. Okay, and one Thursday evening, the leader of the left parties, Sitaram Yechury, sat in the NDTV studios and said, somebody asked a question. There was a Department of Disinvestment in the earlier NDA government, Vajpayee government. So he was asked, what will you do? So he said, we may close it down. Okay? And I think he just said it in jest. Okay? That was not a thought out, but he said we may close it down because we are ideologically opposed to privatization. Right? That was a Thursday night, 9 o'clock TV interview. Okay? I still remember that, Barkhadat, I think. Right? The next day was called Black Friday. Okay? The census tanked by 8,000 points or so. Not 8,000. Some thousands. I forgot what it was. Right? That's one guy sitting in a studio and saying something about a government department. Right? Is enough to create a Black Friday. Millions of rupees flows out in one day. One day means first 2 hours in the morning, 9 to 11. In 11:30 you are tanked. Right? And then at 11:30 the finance minister has to run out of his office and say, don't go, everything is fine, we will not change anything, blah, blah, blah. And then it slows down, So it keeps you constantly at threat. The moment you give a small indication of a change in public policy, they react violently and volatilely, in a very volatile form. Okay? Now, interest rates falling can discourage them. Fiscal compression can disturb them. Fiscal deficit rising can disturb them. Any changes in the regulations of finance can disturb them. Any kind of measure that gives the indication that you are going to roll back on some liberalization policy can actually also scare them into going out. Okay? So a number of things can force them to go out quickly in a few hours. New technology allows it. You can sit in New York and pull millions of dollars out of the Mumbai Stock Exchange. Right? Now, when the point is, what happens when this flows out? Okay? It flows out means you have to give them. They will take dollars and go, right? And you have to give. Because if you don't give, you are becoming a sovereign default. You can't refuse. You stay here, I'm not giving you dollars. You can't say that. Because then the world will crash on you. That you're worsening the problem by not allowing them to pull back their money. So you allow them to take back their dollars. Then what's the impact on the currency? Currency will tank, right? The price of dollar goes up relative to the rupee, and 50 to 60, 70, and you make it, right? That's good for exporters, but bad for importers. Will you stop your imports? No, because you're stuck with a particular pattern of importing, right? Now you will start. Then you will have to pay more and more. Then you're actually, if you are not able. That's exactly what happened in India. You had to pay for oil, you had to pay for gold. Right? And your currency was tanking, depreciating. So first you try to stop gold imports, right? So that you have to pay less foreign exchange to people who want to go out. Right? For imports, I'm sorry. Right? So you can do certain things like this, but some imports you cannot. Oil imports you cannot stop. Right? You cannot say nobody gets petrol from tomorrow. Right? The point is, this creates new vulnerabilities in the economy when capital flows out. And capital flows out, it can actually even affect your growth rates adversely, because a lot of your investments are in real estate and all that, which is actually pulling up the growth rates significantly. And when these investments also go out, these sectors enter into a crisis. They may have taken loans from banks. These loans are not repaid to the banks. Banks enter a period of crisis, and then banks also tank, and then the crisis slowly spreads. It originates at one place and then spreads. Unless you have strong regulations in other financial sectors like banks, you are it will quickly spread and all other sectors will collapse. Right? If you have some protection in the other sectors, okay, for instance, India did not have a privatized banking sector ever after 1969. Okay? So India is slightly more immune to banking crisis compared to other. Even if capital flows out, you are in some form guaranteed your deposits in the banking sector, and that doesn't create a crisis of sorts. But in other countries where the financial sector, every other financial sector is also liberalized, it can have a drastic impact. Okay?